The kingdom of Valdros was a land of myths and legends, built upon the bones of empires long forgotten. Its people whispered tales of gods and demons, of wars that had shaken the earth and left scars upon the sky. But those were just stories, spoken to frightened children or amused travelers gathered around the warmth of a fire. In truth, Valdros had known peace for generations, free from the grasp of dark sorcery or the terror of the undead. Its wars were fought by men, and its politics were ruled by crowns and coin, not by shadows. Yet that peace was crumbling. It began with the land itself. In the early hours of dawn, farmers would rise from their beds, only to find their fields blighted and blackened. Crops that had stood tall and ripe the day before now lay withered and rotting under a sky that seemed too pale, the sun struggling to pierce through a veil of mist that lingered far longer than it should. The winds carried an unnatural chill, and the animals grew restless, their eyes wide and wild with fear of something unseen. Worse still were the graves. The dead were no longer content to rest beneath the earth. In the dead of night, villagers would hear a rustling, a scratching sound, like bones grinding against stone. By morning, the graves were open, the coffins splintered, and the bodies gone. Panic gripped the small towns and hamlets that dotted the countryside, but the royal court of Valdros remained distant, unconcerned with the troubles of the rural folk. They believed it to be mere superstition, tales spun out of fear. Draven knew better. For months, he had been plagued by visions, dark, terrible dreams that would come upon him in the quiet hours of the night. In these dreams, he stood before a throne of bones, and seated upon it was a woman, her face veiled in shadows. Her eyes, however, shone with an eerie light, piercing through the darkness like the glow of a distant star. She spoke no words, but her presence was suffocating, a weight upon his soul. Every night, her gaze grew more intense, her power more palpable, until he could feel her cold breath upon his skin. He awoke each time drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his breath shallow. He had faced many horrors in his life, war, death, betrayal, but this was something else. This was beyond the natural order. It was as though the dead themselves were calling out to him, their cold fingers grasping at the edges of his mind. Draven was a man of scars, both seen and unseen. His life had been one of blood and battle, of service to lords who cared little for the men who fought and died for their causes. He had known glory once, in the days of his youth, but those days were long behind him. Now he was little more than a mercenary, a sword for hire, drifting from one conflict to another, haunted by the ghosts of his past. The visions began after he had returned from a campaign in the east, where he had been hired to defend a small border town from marauding raiders. The battle had been fierce, and though they had won, Draven had lost many of his men, friends and comrades who had fought at his side for years. Their faces were among the many that haunted his dreams, but it was the woman on the throne who unsettled him most. She seemed to be waiting for him, watching, as though he were the final piece in a game only she understood. He tried to shake the visions, to bury them beneath drink and distraction, but they always returned. And with them came the whispers. The Queen of the Dead, the villagers called her, a name spoken only in hushed tones. Draven had heard of her before in the old tales. Queen Isolde, a ruler of Valdros who had lived centuries ago, her reign marked by prosperity, but also by betrayal and bloodshed. According to legend, she had been a sorceress of great power, and when she was overthrown by a cabal of treacherous nobles, they had bound her soul to the world of the living, trapping her in a state between life and death. The myths said her body had been sealed in a tomb deep within the mountains, her spirit cursed to wander forever. Few believed the tales anymore. Valdros had moved on from its superstitious past, its people more concerned with trade routes and border skirmishes than with the ghosts of ancient queens. But Draven could not shake the feeling that the old stories were more than just tales. The vision of the woman, seated upon her throne of bones, bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Isolde. And the disturbances, the blighted crops, the restless dead, these were signs of necromancy, an art long thought lost to the ages. He had seen enough death to recognize its presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mists crept across the land like a living thing, Draven sat in the corner of a dimly lit tavern in the town of Evershade. The tavern was quiet. The few patrons gathered around their drinks, speaking in low voices. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settled in a place when the world outside grew darker and more uncertain with each passing day. Draven was not alone at his table. Across from him sat a woman wrapped in a dark cloak, her face hidden beneath the hood. Her name was Celia, a mage with a reputation for dabbling in forbidden arts. They had met years ago during a campaign against a band of rogue sorcerers, and though their paths had diverged since then, they had remained in contact. "Something is stirring," Celia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it, the balance between life and death. It's shifting." Draven took a long drink from his cup, the bitter ale doing little to calm his nerves. "I've been having dreams," he admitted, his voice rough. "Visions of a woman, a queen." Celia's eyes flashed beneath her hood. "Isolde." Draven nodded slowly. "I think she's returned." For a moment, there was silence between them. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faint sound of something scraping across the cobblestone streets. Celia's fingers tightened around the edge of her cloak. "If she's back," Celia said, "then it's worse than we thought. Necromancy on this scale. It could mean the end of everything. The dead don't rise unless they're called." Draven leaned forward, his gaze dark. "Then we need to find out who's calling them, and stop them." Celia hesitated. "It might not be that simple. If Isolde has returned, she might not be the villain of this story." Draven frowned. "What do you mean?" "There's more to her legend than most know," Celia replied. "She was betrayed, yes, but not just by her enemies. Those closest to her. They feared her power and they destroyed her for it. If she's returned, it might not be out of malice. It might be for vengeance." Draven's blood chilled at the thought. He had fought many battles, but this was something far darker. And the line between right and wrong was growing ever more blurred. The woman in his dreams, the queen of the dead, was no mere monster. She was something far more dangerous. And Draven feared that, before long, her eyes would be upon him once more. The night after his conversation with Celia felt heavier, as though the air itself was laced with whispers of doom. Draven's mind churned with thoughts of the dead queen, of the betrayal that had sealed her fate, and of the strange connection he felt to her. As the wind howled outside, carrying with it the eerie chill of death, he knew that his path was set. Whatever was happening in Valdros, whatever ancient force was stirring in the shadows, he could not walk away. But he could not do it alone. It was on the second night, as Draven prepared to leave Evershade, that he encountered the first of those who would become his unlikely companions in the quest to stop, or perhaps understand, Queen Isolde's return. The tavern was crowded, more than usual. News of strange happenings in nearby villages had driven merchants, travelers, and farmers alike to the relative safety of the town's high walls. Among the bustling crowd, Draven spotted a figure sitting alone in the corner, his broad shoulders cloaked in the unmistakable armor of a knight. His face was weathered, with deep-set eyes that bore the weariness of a man who had seen too much war. He was drinking alone, a near-empty tankard in front of him, staring into the flickering flames of the hearth as though searching for answers in the dancing light. Draven approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of the sword at his hip. "I hear knights don't usually drink in the company of peasants," he said, his voice rough but edged with curiosity. The knight lifted his gaze, meeting Draven's eyes with a cold, hard stare. "Not usually," he replied, "but I'm not much of a knight these days." Draven studied him for a moment. This man was no mere soldier. His armor, though worn and tarnished, bore the sigil of the Order of the Silver Flame, a legendary order of knights sworn to protect the realm from the forces of darkness. They had once been revered, but in recent years, their numbers had dwindled, and their purpose had been called into question. It was said they were as cursed as those they hunted, too zealous in their pursuit of evil. "I'm Draven," he said, lowering himself into the chair opposite the knight, "and I think you might be just the man I need." The knight said nothing at first, merely lifting his tankard and taking a long drink before setting it down again with a heavy thud. "You need a man who's lost his honor? Who's seen his brothers fall to madness and despair?" His voice was cold, bitter, as though the weight of his past was too much to bear. Draven smiled grimly. "I need someone who's seen darkness and lived to tell the tale. Someone who knows what it's like to be haunted by the past." The knight studied him in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. "Rhaegar, formerly of the Order of the Silver Flame, as you've no doubt guessed." Draven nodded. "I've heard of your order. You were sworn to fight the undead, weren't you?" Rhaegar's eyes narrowed. "We were, and we did. Until we realized that the darkness wasn't just in the monsters we fought. It was in the very people we served. Corruption, greed, betrayal. The same things that fuel the creatures we hunt. It's all connected." Draven leaned forward, his voice low. "Then you know what's happening here in Valdros. You've heard the stories of the dead rising, of the old queen's return." Rhaegar's expression darkened. "I've heard. And if the queen of the dead has truly returned, then we're facing something far worse than just a few walking corpses." Draven's heart pounded in his chest. "Celia, the mage I've been working with, thinks there's more to the story. Isolde wasn't just a tyrant. She was betrayed by her own people. If she's returned, it might be to seek revenge." Rhaegar shook his head, his eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Revenge? Vengeance never ends well. I've seen what it does to people, how it twists them into something worse than what they were fighting against." Draven remained silent, contemplating Rhaegar's words. He knew the knight was right, but there was something about the queen's story that gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was not simply a monster to be slain. And yet, how could they justify aiding a lich? As they spoke, the tavern door swung open with a crash, letting in a gust of wind and a figure cloaked in dark robes. Heads turned as the newcomer stepped inside, shaking off the chill of the evening. Her hood was drawn low over her face, but there was no mistaking her presence. It was Celia. She strode toward them, her eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made even the bravest men avoid her gaze. When she reached their table, she spoke without preamble. "We have a problem." Rhaegar raised an eyebrow. Another one? Celia ignored the comment, pulling up a chair and sitting down. Her voice was low, urgent. There's a necromancer in the city. I tracked him to the lower district, near the river. Draven's eyes narrowed. A necromancer? What would a necromancer be doing in Evershade? Celia hesitated. I'm not sure, but it can't be a coincidence. Not with everything that's been happening. Rhaegar leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. And you think this necromancer is connected to Isolde? Celia nodded slowly. I do. The magic that's been stirring in the land. The dead rising, the blighted fields. It all points to necromancy. And if someone's been trying to bring Isolde back, they'll need powerful magic to do it. Whoever this necromancer is, he might know more about what's going on. Draven's mind raced. The pieces were starting to come together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Then we need to find him, he said, before things get worse. I've already found him, Celia replied. But there's more. He's not acting alone. There are others, a cult, I think, working to summon her. Draven cursed under his breath. A cult? How many? Celia shook her head. I don't know, but it's growing. There's been talk of strange gatherings in the woods outside the city. They're preparing for something big. If we don't stop them soon, we might be too late. Rhaegar's face hardened. Then we need to stop them. Now. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their task settling over them like a shroud. They were few, and the enemy was unknown and powerful. But they had no choice. The dead were stirring, and if they didn't act, the entire kingdom of Valdros would be consumed by darkness. Draven stood, gripping the hilt of his sword. Then let's find this necromancer, and find out exactly what he's trying to summon. Celia and Rhaegar followed, their faces grim but determined. Together, they made their way through the darkened streets of Evershade, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The city seemed quiet, too quiet, as though it was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. As they approached the river district, the air grew colder, and the streets became narrower, twisting like a labyrinth of shadows. It was a part of the city few dared to venture after nightfall, a place where thieves and outcasts made their homes, and where the stench of rot and decay hung heavy in the air. At the edge of the district, Celia stopped, pointing to a decrepit building half hidden by the mist. "He's in there," she whispered. "But be careful. Necromancers have a way of making traps, and of turning the dead against the living." Draven and Rhaegar exchanged glances. They had both faced death many times before, but this was different. They were walking into the domain of the dead, into the lair of a man who wielded the power of life and death like a weapon. And yet they pressed forward. The door creaked open under Draven's hand, revealing a dark, crumbling interior. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were lined with shelves of ancient, crumbling tomes. In the center of the room, a figure stood, hunched over a table cluttered with bones, candles, and strange symbols carved into the wood. The necromancer. He turned slowly as they entered, his eyes gleaming with the sickly light of forbidden magic. His lips twisted into a smile. "You're too late," he hissed. "The queen is already rising." Draven's heart raced, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. The summoning had already begun. The crypt lay miles to the north, buried deep in the shadow of the Ironfang Mountains, where the cold winds howled like the wails of the dead. It was an ancient place, older than the kingdom itself, and said to be a resting ground for the cursed and the forsaken. It was there, in that forgotten tomb, that Queen Isolde had been imprisoned centuries ago. If they were to stop the resurrection, or at least understand it, they would have to go there, to the place where it all began. The journey was long, but the distance wasn't what concerned Draven. As they set out from Evershade at dawn, the sun barely cresting the horizon, he could already feel the weight of something oppressive bearing down upon them. The air was thick, like the very land was watching, waiting for them to falter. They rode in silence for much of the day, the tension between them palpable. Rhaegar led the way, his armor clinking softly with every step of his steed, his hand never far from the hilt of his great sword. Celia followed closely behind, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, fingers twitching with the readiness of one who expected danger at every turn. Draven, however, found his thoughts drifting. The memory of the necromancer's last words gnawed at him. "The queen is already rising." The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of impending dread. Had they truly arrived too late? Was Isolde already beyond their reach, her power spreading unchecked across the kingdom? Worse still, the more he thought of her, the more he felt a strange connection to her story, a resonance with her pain. Betrayal, vengeance, a hunger for justice. These were emotions he knew all too well. The hours passed, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, they reached the edge of the Blackwood Forest. The forest was ancient, its towering trees gnarled and twisted like the hands of long-forgotten gods. The path through the woods was narrow and overgrown, barely more than a trail, and the deeper they ventured, the darker the world around them became. The light seemed to die here, swallowed by the dense canopy above, leaving them in an eerie twilight that made the skin prickle with unease. It wasn't long before they encountered the first of the undead. They appeared without warning, emerging from the trees like ghosts. Their bodies were decayed, barely more than bones wrapped in rotting flesh, but their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. There was no sound, no growl or moan, only the soft rustling of dry leaves as they marched forward, arms outstretched as if driven by some unseen force. Rhaegar drew his sword with a flash of steel, his voice steady despite the horror unfolding before them. "We've been expected." Draven unsheathed his own blade, the familiar weight of it in his hand providing little comfort. "They're not acting on their own," he muttered. "Something's controlling them." Celia's voice was tight. "It's her. It has to be. Isolde's influence is spreading faster than I thought." There was no time for more words. The undead closed in, their bony fingers grasping at the living with an eerie silence that made the battle feel like a nightmare. Draven's sword cut through the first of them, cleaving through decayed flesh and brittle bone, but more kept coming, as though the very earth itself was disgorging the dead. For every one they felled, another two appeared, their hollow eyes glowing with the same malevolent light. Rhaegar fought like a man possessed, his sword flashing in deadly arcs, each swing shattering bones and sending the undead crumbling to the ground. But even he couldn't hold them off forever. "They just keep coming," he shouted, his voice strained as he decapitated another skeletal figure. Celia, her hands glowing with arcane energy, hurled bursts of fire into the advancing horde, but the flames seemed to do little more than slow them down. The dead didn't fear pain, nor did they retreat. They were relentless. Draven knew they couldn't win a drawn-out fight here, not against these numbers. "We need to move," he shouted. "We can't take them all." Rhaegar grunted in agreement, driving his sword through the chest of one of the undead before turning and urging his horse forward. "Go! I'll cover the rear." Celia followed suit, her horse galloping down the path, her magic flickering like dying embers as she hurled a final spell to scatter the nearest of the dead. Draven brought up the rear, his sword flashing in quick, decisive strikes as they broke through the line of undead and plunged deeper into the forest. But as they rode, the landscape around them began to change. The trees grew darker, more twisted, their branches curling like claws toward the sky. The air became thick with the stench of rot and decay, and the ground beneath their horses' hooves turned black, as though the very earth itself had been poisoned. The deeper they went, the more the land seemed to turn against them. Rocks jutted out from the ground like the broken bones of the earth, and strange mists began to swirl around them, obscuring the path. It wasn't just the undead. The land itself was becoming hostile. "This place, it's not natural," Rhaegar muttered, his eyes scanning the twisted landscape. "It feels like we're being swallowed." Celia's voice was tight with fear. "Isolde's power is warping the land. She's changing it, turning it into something dead." Draven felt a chill run down his spine. The air was heavy with an oppressive weight, as if they were walking through the domain of something ancient and malevolent. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the undead but by the land itself, by whatever dark force had awakened with Isolde's return. They pressed on, their pace quickening as the horde of undead continued to gather behind them. The farther they went, the more twisted the land became, and soon, it was as though they were walking through a nightmare. The trees became skeletal, their bark cracked and dead, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. Strange shadows flitted between the trees, and at times, Draven thought he saw faces, pale, gaunt, and hungry, staring back at him from the darkness. The mists thickened, swirling around their feet, and the ground itself felt wrong, spongy and cold like the flesh of a long-dead corpse. And then the voices began. At first, they were faint, little more than whispers on the wind. But as they ventured deeper, they grew louder, more insistent. They called to them, soft, seductive voices that seemed to rise from the very earth, promising things Draven didn't want to hear, promising him an end to his pain, to his regrets. "You don't have to suffer any longer. Join us, Draven. Be free." He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. But the voices wouldn't stop. They grew louder, more persistent, worming their way into his mind. He could feel the temptation creeping in, an overwhelming urge to give in, to surrender to the darkness, to let the dead claim him. It was the same voice he had heard in his dreams, the voice of the Queen. He glanced at Celia and Rhaegar. Their faces were pale, their expressions drawn tight with the same strain he felt. They heard it too. "We can't stop," Draven said, his voice hoarse. "If we stop now, we'll never make it out." Rhaegar nodded, but his eyes were distant, as though he were struggling with his own demons. "The dead want us to join them." Celia's hands tightened on her reins. "It's Isolde's influence. She's reaching out, trying to break us before we even reach her." Draven's thoughts raced. The line between right and wrong was becoming more blurred with every step. Was this truly the work of a villain? Or was Isolde simply a victim, crying out for justice? His visions, her pain, it all felt too familiar. He had been betrayed once too. He had sought vengeance. He knew what it was like to be driven by rage. But he had never become this. As they rode deeper into the nightmare, The voices grew into a cacophony, each word scraping against Draven's mind like nails on stone. His body ached, his heart pounded, and his thoughts twisted with doubt. The world around him seemed to close in, and for a moment, he thought he might give in, might let the darkness claim him. But then, in the distance, he saw it. A shape looming out of the mists, the entrance to the crypt. They had arrived. But even as they approached, Draven couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. This was no ordinary tomb. This was a place of power, a place where death and life had no meaning. And as they neared the entrance, the air grew colder, the voices louder, until it felt as though the very walls of reality were bending under the weight of Isolde's will. The crypt was waiting for them, and so was the Queen of the Dead. The entrance to the crypt loomed before them, a jagged, yawning maw of stone that seemed to swallow all light. The air was thick with decay and the scent of ancient dust, and as the adventurers stood at the threshold, a palpable weight pressed down upon them. The tomb had been undisturbed for centuries, its purpose clear, to imprison, not to rest. And yet, Queen Isolde had found a way to stir, a way to twist her prison into a channel for her wrath. Draven was the first to step forward, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest, not out of fear, but because something deep within him was pulling him toward the crypt, like a whisper only he could hear. The visions had been coming more frequently, haunting him with flashes of Isolde's past, and with each step he took, the weight of her anguish grew heavier in his mind. "This place feels wrong," Rhaegar muttered, gripping the hilt of his sword as he moved to Draven's side. The knight's usual stoicism was cracking, his brow furrowed with unease. "Like it's alive, waiting for us." Celia, her face pale in the flickering light of her staff, whispered softly. This crypt was built to contain more than just her body. It's a place of power, of dark magic bound by betrayal. We must be careful. The three exchanged glances, the unspoken question lingering between them. What were they truly walking into? The cold stone walls of the crypt closed in around them as they descended, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the dark corridors like distant thunder. Torches mounted on the walls sputtered with ancient flame, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. Strange carvings lined the walls, scenes of Isolde's life, each one more grotesque than the last. The first chamber they entered was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At its center stood a massive stone sarcophagus, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly with a sinister, green light. But it was the murals that caught Draven's attention. The story they told was unlike anything he had expected. The first mural depicted Queen Isolde, crowned in gold, her face radiant with youthful beauty. She stood before a cheering crowd, her arms raised in triumph, a beacon of hope for her people. The kingdom had been prosperous under her rule, her strength and wisdom bringing an era of peace. But as they moved deeper into the chamber, the story began to change. The second mural showed her surrounded by advisors, their faces twisted with jealousy and greed. They whispered behind her back, their eyes gleaming with malice. The queen's smile had faded, her once bright eyes darkened with suspicion. Draven felt a pang in his chest as he stared at her face, her isolation and growing distrust mirroring something he had felt in his own life. The third mural was the darkest. It showed Isolde kneeling before a throne, her hands bound in chains. Her closest advisors loomed over her, their faces now monstrous, their hands dripping with the blood of betrayal. In the background, Her people turned their backs on her, abandoning the queen they once loved. The runes on the walls flickered as though reacting to the pain and fury etched in the stone. Draven's breath caught in his throat. It was one thing to hear of her betrayal, another to see it immortalized in this way, each image seething with the queen's anguish. "These carvings," Celia whispered, her eyes wide. "They're not just history, they're a warning." Rhaegar stepped closer, his eyes narrowed as he studied the scenes. She wasn't just betrayed, she was destroyed by the very people she swore to protect. Draven clenched his fists, his pulse quickening. He could feel her pain, seeping into his mind, the lines between their memories beginning to blur. For a moment, he wasn't sure where his thoughts ended and hers began. He saw flashes of her final moments, the cold steel of betrayal, the bitter taste of vengeance as her heart turned black. As they moved deeper into the crypt, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. Strange shadows danced at the edges of their vision, and the whispers that had plagued them in the forest returned, louder now, echoing through the halls in twisted, indecipherable tongues. It was in the final chamber that they found the truth. The room was smaller, more intimate, and at its center stood a pedestal, atop which lay a single, shattered crown. The air around it shimmered with dark magic, the remnants of Isolde's power swirling like a storm. But it was the inscription on the walls that drew their attention. Written in an ancient tongue, Celia knelt beside it, tracing her fingers along the words as she translated. "Betrayed by those I loved, forsaken by my people, but I shall rise again. I shall return to reclaim what was stolen. My vengeance shall be their curse, my wrath their undoing. They will know what it means to fear the dead." Draven's heart pounded. The words rang with truth, with a pain that echoed through time. Isolde hadn't been a villain, not at first. She had been wronged, consumed by her desire for justice. Her resurrection wasn't driven solely by malice. It was a cry for vengeance against those who had stolen her life. He staggered back, his hand pressed to his temple as another vision overtook him. He saw Isolde, her once beautiful face twisted in anguish, kneeling before the betrayers who had condemned her. Her hands reached out, desperate, pleading for mercy. But there was none. The chains bit into her wrists as they dragged her away, and as the stone door of her tomb slammed shut, sealing her away from the world, her scream echoed in Draven's mind, a scream of betrayal, of a promise unfulfilled. When he opened his eyes, the room was silent, save for the flicker of the torches. "She didn't deserve this," he murmured, his voice hoarse. She was a victim." Rhaegar turned to him, his expression unreadable. "We've all been victims at some point, Draven. That doesn't justify the path she's chosen now. Look around you. This is no longer the work of a queen. It's the work of a monster." Draven's jaw tightened. "But what if we're wrong? What if there's still a chance to stop this without killing her?" Rhaegar's eyes flashed with anger. "You've seen the dead she commands. You've felt her power warping the land itself. There's no coming back from that. She's not a ruler seeking justice. She's a lich bent on destruction." Celia's voice was calm but firm. "We can't deny what we've seen. Isolde's power is growing, and with it, her hunger for vengeance. But perhaps Draven is right. Perhaps there's more to this. We need to understand why she was betrayed, who orchestrated her downfall. If we can find the true culprits, maybe we can end this without more bloodshed." Rhaegar glared at her. "And what if you're wrong? What if by hesitating, We give her more time to strengthen her hold on the kingdom. Do you really think a lich like her can be reasoned with? Draven's heart raced, the decision tearing at him. Every fiber of his being wanted to believe that Isolde could still be saved, that the woman whose pain he had felt wasn't beyond redemption. But Rhaegar's words weighed heavily on him as well. They had seen the horrors she was capable of. And yet, this isn't about justifying her actions, Draven said, his voice low. It's about understanding why she's doing this. If we destroy her now, we'll never know the truth. We'll never know if there was another way. Rhaegar's face darkened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of their decision. Finally, it was Celia who spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. We need to decide. Do we destroy her, or do we try to end this another way? Draven looked down at the shattered crown, its broken pieces a symbol of the betrayal that had sparked this nightmare. His visions, the queen's pain, it all blurred the lines between right and wrong. Could they really judge her for wanting vengeance when so many had done the same for less? As the silence deepened, the air in the crypt grew colder, the shadows pressing in around them, and somewhere in the distance, they heard it, a slow, deliberate footstep echoing through the halls. She was coming, and with her, the decision they could no longer avoid. The crypt's air grew colder, heavy with a presence that clung to their skin like frost. The torches sputtered, casting weak, trembling light across the stone walls. Every breath felt labored, the weight of the tomb pressing down on them. The adventurers stood in tense silence, the decision hanging between them like a blade poised to fall. Draven's mind raced, his thoughts fractured and twisted with doubt. Isolde's memories still clawed at the edges of his consciousness, whispering to him, pleading with him. His hands trembled as he gripped the hilt of his sword, feeling the cold weight of steel and the unbearable pressure of the choice that loomed before them. We're running out of time, Rhaegar growled, pacing like a caged beast. His armor clinked with every step, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet of the crypt. She's coming, and we can't afford to hesitate any longer. Celia, her staff glowing faintly in the dim light, glanced between Draven and Rhaegar, her face etched with concern. Rhaegar's right. Every second we delay, Isolde grows stronger. But we can't rush this decision. There's more at play here than just destroying a monster. Draven felt their eyes on him, waiting, judging, as if the final decision rested on his shoulders alone. And maybe it did. He had been the one to feel her anguish, to see her betrayal firsthand. He had seen the woman behind the lich, the protector turned predator. But he had also seen the devastation she had wrought. Undead armies, twisted landscapes, a kingdom dying under her shadow. Her pain, Draven muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I can feel it. It's overwhelming. She's not just a lich. She's a victim. A victim. Rhaegar's voice was hard, cutting through the silence like a blade. Look around you, Draven. You've seen what she's done. Whatever she once was, that part of her is gone. All that's left is her hunger for vengeance. Draven met Rhaegar's gaze, his eyes burning with frustration. And what if we're wrong? What if there's still something left of her? Something we can save. She was a protector once. She fought for her people. If we kill her now, without understanding why this happened, we're no better than those who betrayed her. Rhaegar's jaw clenched, his hand tightening on his sword's hilt. You're letting her inside your head, Draven. That's what she wants. She's twisting your thoughts, making you doubt. I won't let her manipulate us. Draven wanted to argue, to fight against Rhaegar's certainty. But the truth was, doubt had already taken root. He didn't know who to trust anymore. Not Rhaegar, not Celia, and least of all himself. The lines between reality and the visions were blurring. His own thoughts merging with Isolde's, her memories bleeding into his. Celia stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We don't know the full story, Rhaegar. We've seen glimpses of her past, but we don't understand the full depth of what happened here. If there's even a chance that Isolde can be redeemed, we owe it to the kingdom and to her to try." Rhaegar's eyes flashed with anger. "And if we fail? If she destroys us and then marches on the kingdom with her undead army? Do you really want to gamble with that?" Draven's head swam, the weight of the decision crushing him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the cold stone walls of the crypt seemed to melt away, replaced by a distant memory. No, not his memory. Isolde's. He was standing in a grand hall, light streaming through tall windows. The faces of courtiers blurred around him, whispers and murmurs filling the space. Isolde stood at the center, radiant and proud, her crown gleaming atop her head. But the admiration in the room was hollow, false. The advisors surrounding her smiled with practiced deceit, their eyes betraying their true intentions. "I gave everything for this kingdom." Her voice echoed in Draven's mind, a mix of fury and heartbreak. "And they betrayed me. They turned my people against me. They left me to rot." The vision shifted, darkening. The grand hall faded into the cold, damp crypt, the crown atop her head now a twisted, blackened thing. Her flesh had decayed, her once beautiful face a hollow, skeletal visage. And yet, her eyes still burned with that same desperate need for justice. "You know what it's like, don't you, Draven?" The voice was no longer distant. It was inside his mind, pressing against his thoughts. "You know what it means to be betrayed, to seek vengeance. We are the same." "No!" Draven gasped, stumbling backward, his hand pressing against his forehead as if to push the voice away. But it was everywhere, surrounding him, suffocating him. Isolde's pain was his own, her fury intertwined with his soul. Celia rushed to his side, her voice urgent. "Draven, what's happening?" Draven shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. She's inside my mind. I can feel her, her memories, her anger. It's all mixed up with mine." Rhaegar cursed under his breath. "This is exactly what I feared. She's trying to control you, Draven. We need to act now before it's too late." But Draven wasn't sure anymore. Was it control? Or was it something deeper? A shared understanding between two souls who had been wronged, who had been left to fester in their own rage. "You don't have to fight me, Draven," Isolde's voice whispered, softer now, more seductive. "We can end this together. We can take back what was stolen from us. All you have to do is trust me." Draven's grip on his sword tightened. The weight of the choice bore down on him. Was Isolde beyond saving, as Rhaegar believed? Or was there still hope, as Celia insisted? He didn't know anymore. All he knew was that the woman who had once protected her kingdom had been twisted by forces beyond her control. Forces that now threatened to consume them all. And then, from the darkness, she emerged. Queen Isolde, the Lich Queen, stepped into the chamber. Her skeletal form was draped in tattered robes, her crown of bones gleaming atop her head. The air around her crackled with necromantic energy, the shadows bending to her will. But her eyes, those burning, hollow eyes, were locked onto Draven, filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Was it hatred? Or was it something more? Something that mirrored the conflict raging within him? "So," she said, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate through the crypt, "you've come to destroy me, or perhaps—" Her gaze flickered to Draven, a hint of recognition in her expression. "You've come to join me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Reger's hand twitched toward his sword, his body tense, ready to strike. Celia stood frozen, her eyes wide with uncertainty, and Draven could barely breathe. His mind was awash with Isolde's memories, her pain, her betrayal. He understood her perhaps more than he understood himself. But the question remained, was she still the protector she once was? Or had her quest for vengeance twisted her beyond redemption? "We don't have to be enemies," Isolde said, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I fought for this kingdom, for the people who betrayed me. I fought to protect them, and in return, they cast me into this tomb. They turned me into this monster. But we can change that, Draven. Together, we can make them pay." Draven's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel her presence, the weight of her power, the depth of her pain. And he could feel the temptation, the lure of vengeance, of finally righting the wrongs that had been done to both of them. But was that the path he wanted to walk? Reger's voice broke the silence, cold and resolute. "We end this now." Draven's hand trembled on the hilt of his sword. The decision was his, to destroy her, or to understand her, to be a hero, or to be something else entirely. Time seemed to slow as the Lich Queen's eyes bore into his soul, and Draven realized that, in this moment, the fate of not just Isolde, but the entire kingdom hung in the balance. And whatever choice he made, there would be no turning back. The air crackled with necromantic power, each breath laced with a cold that pierced deeper than any blade. Isolde stood before them, her skeletal form radiating a dark, haunting majesty. The crown of bones atop her head seemed to pulse with a sickly green light, casting long shadows across the crypt's ancient walls. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the weight of centuries of betrayal, hatred, and vengeance. Draven's mind was in turmoil. The visions had grown unbearable, surging through him in waves, fragments of a truth too horrifying to fully comprehend. Isolde's pain was his own now, her memories flooding his senses. He saw her final moments as queen, not as the tyrant she had been portrayed, but as a protector, one who had been sacrificed for daring to defy a darker, more insidious power. "Draven, focus." Reger's voice cut through the haze like a dagger, dragging Draven back to the present. The knight's face was etched with determination, but there was a hardness in his eyes, a refusal to see the shades of gray that had enveloped their journey. To him, the world was still black and white. Isolde was a monster, and monsters needed to be destroyed. Celia stood beside them, her staff glowing faintly in the dim light, her expression conflicted. The magical energy in the air made the hairs on her arms stand on end, and the weight of the choice they faced seemed to bear down on her. She had seen the truth too, the glimpses of Isolde's past that Draven had shared. But like Draven, she was torn. The Lich Queen before them was not simply a villain. She had been wronged, twisted by forces beyond her control. But the time for indecision was gone. Isolde raised her hand, and the ground beneath them trembled. From the crypt's depths, the dead began to rise, skeletons, long-decayed corpses, and spirits bound in chains of spectral fire. Her army of the damned, twisted by necromancy, moved as one, eyes glowing with the same eerie green light that pulsed from Isolde's crown. "Your kingdom is already lost." Isolde's voice echoed through the crypt, cold and hollow. "They betrayed me, and they will betray you. You are nothing to them but pawns, just as I was." Rhaegar stepped forward, drawing his sword with a grim resolve. "Enough of this. We will end your reign of terror here and now." Draven wanted to shout, to stop Rhaegar from charging headfirst into the battle, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the surge of power in the air, the overwhelming force of Isolde's necromancy. And deeper still, he could feel the pull of her past, the full scope of the betrayal she had suffered, the dark force that had orchestrated her downfall. As Rhaegar lunged, his sword aimed for the Lich Queen's heart, Isolde barely moved. With a flick of her wrist, she summoned a barrier of crackling green energy, deflecting the blow effortlessly. Her skeletal fingers clenched into a fist, and with a whispered incantation, the ground beneath Rhaegar's feet erupted, a mass of skeletal hands dragging him to his knees. "You cannot defeat me," Isolde hissed, her voice laced with centuries of fury. "I am beyond your mortal strength." Celia unleashed a blast of arcane light from her staff, striking at the undead that swarmed around them. Her magic cut through the horde, but for every undead she felled, two more took its place. The crypt was alive with death, a ceaseless tide of bodies and bones that sought to overwhelm them. Draven's mind spun as the battle raged around him. He saw flashes of Isolde's life, her coronation, her victories, her people's love for her. But then came the betrayal, the whispers in the shadows, the treacherous advisors who had turned her own kingdom against her. They had not acted out of fear of tyranny, but out of fear of what Isolde had discovered, a far darker force that threatened to consume the world. In his mind, Draven saw the shadow of that force, an ancient, primordial darkness that had slithered into the heart of the kingdom, corrupting its leaders, twisting their minds. Isolde had fought against it, had tried to protect her people from it, but in doing so, she had become a threat to those who wielded true power behind the throne. "They killed her because she knew," Draven whispered, his voice hoarse with the weight of the revelation. "She wasn't the villain. She was trying to stop something worse." Celia, fending off another wave of undead, glanced at him, her eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" Draven's heart pounded in his chest, the visions crashing over him like a storm. He saw the dark force more clearly now, a formless entity of shadow, an ancient evil that had wormed its way into the kingdom's soul. Isolde had been its enemy, the last line of defense between her people and the abyss. But they hadn't understood. They had been manipulated just as she had been. "We're fighting the wrong enemy," Draven said, his voice trembling. "Isolde wasn't the one we should fear. It's the force that corrupted her kingdom, the one that led to her execution. If we destroy her now, we're opening the door for that darkness to return." Rhaegar, struggling against the skeletal hands that held him down, spat blood as he glared at Draven. "What are you saying? She's the one raising the dead. She's the one killing innocent people." Draven shook his head, stepping toward the Lich Queen. "She was twisted by their betrayal, by centuries of pain and hatred. But it all began with that darkness. She's the last thing keeping it at bay." Isolde's hollow eyes turned toward him, a flicker of recognition passing through them. For a moment, the weight of her skeletal form seemed to lessen, the burning wrath in her gaze softening. You see it, don't you?" she whispered, her voice no longer filled with malice but with an ancient sorrow. "The truth of what I fought for." Draven swallowed hard. "I see it. You were betrayed, not because you were a tyrant, but because you tried to stop something far worse. And now that force is coming back. If we destroy you, it will consume everything." Celia's magic flared as she blasted another wave of undead, her face pale with exhaustion. "Draven, if you're right, then what do? We can't let that darkness return." Draven's gaze shifted between Rhaegar, struggling against the undead, and Isolde, her skeletal form trembling as the weight of centuries of suffering bore down on her. The choice before him was impossible. If they killed Isolde, they risked unleashing a force that could destroy the world. But if they let her live, would she ever be able to free herself from the hatred that had consumed her? "I can't be saved," Isolde said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, resigned sorrow. "My soul is bound to this curse, but you can stop the darkness. If you strike me down now, you'll unleash it. But if you destroy the ones who truly betrayed me, you may yet save the kingdom." Draven's hands shook, his sword feeling like a lead weight in his grasp. The room seemed to spin around him, the crypt's walls pressing in, the undead swarming closer. Time slowed, the weight of his decision crushing him. "Draven!" Rhaegar shouted. "Finish this!" But Draven couldn't move. The truth was too vast, too complex. Isolde wasn't the monster they had been led to believe. She had been twisted by centuries of necromancy, by betrayal, but at her core, she had been a protector. And now, with her undead army at her command, she was the last thing standing between the world and the true darkness that lurked beyond. Draven raised his sword, his heart pounding in his chest. And in that moment, he knew whatever choice he made, it would define the fate of the world. The crypt fell deathly silent, save for the soft hum of necromantic energy crackling in the air. Draven stood frozen, his sword raised, the weight of destiny pressing down on his soul. The cold, green light from Isolde's crown flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the chamber. The army of the dead, countless and unyielding, loomed at the edges of the room, waiting for their queen's command. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, all of Draven's focus was locked on the figure before him. Isolde, the Lich Queen. Her hollow eyes, once filled with fury and malice, now bore an expression Draven had not expected: resignation. She was no longer the embodiment of unrelenting vengeance he had first encountered. In this moment, she was something more, an echo of the woman she had once been, trapped between life and death, between justice and damnation. The crown of bones atop her head seemed to flicker, a symbol of both her power and her curse. "You stand at the crossroads, Draven," Isolde said softly, her voice echoing through the crypt, ancient and sorrowful. "Your choice will determine the fate of more than just me. It will decide the fate of the world." Draven's heart thundered in his chest. He had fought so hard to get here alongside Rhaegar, Celia, and the others. He had believed that their quest was one of righteousness, that slaying the Lich Queen would restore balance to a kingdom plagued by darkness. But now, with the truth laid bare before him, everything had changed. He had seen the betrayal, the lies that had led to Isolde's downfall. And he had seen the dark force that still lingered in the shadows, a force that had twisted the kingdom long before Isolde's rise as the Lich Queen. Celia stepped forward, her eyes wide with the same conflict that churned in Draven's heart. "Draven, whatever you're seeing, I need you to focus. If there's any chance to stop this, Any chance to save the kingdom, we need to know what to do." Draven glanced at her, feeling the weight of her trust. She had followed him this far, despite the horrors they had faced, despite the doubt gnawing at their minds. Rhaegar, standing battered and bloodied, had fought with everything he had, convinced that destroying Isolde was their only path to victory. "And yet, I understand now," Draven said, his voice trembling with the enormity of the revelation. Isolde wasn't the enemy, the real threat. It's still out there. The darkness that corrupted the kingdom, that twisted her fate. It hasn't been defeated. Rhaegar, struggling to stand, spat blood and shook his head. "Enough of this madness, Draven. She's the one raising the dead. She's the one slaughtering innocents. Don't let her manipulate you." Draven turned to him, his gaze steady. "You haven't seen what I've seen, Rhaegar. This isn't just about Isolde. If we kill her, we'll be doing exactly what those who betrayed her wanted. And that darkness, it'll rise again, stronger than ever." A moment of silence passed between them, the tension hanging thick in the air. The undead army remained motionless, awaiting their queen's command. And Isolde, though her power was immense, made no move to strike. She was waiting for Draven to decide, for him to make the choice that would seal her fate. Justice or vengeance? Draven asked himself. Redemption or damnation? The visions continued to swirl in his mind, flashes of the past, of the betrayal that had led to Isolde's death. But now he could also see the future, two possible paths unfolding before him. One where Isolde was destroyed, her soul condemned to oblivion, and the dark force she had fought against would rise unchecked, corrupting the kingdom once more. And the other, the path of vengeance, where Isolde would rise not as a villain, but as an instrument of justice, reclaiming what was stolen from her and exacting her revenge upon the true architects of her fall. But could Draven, who had always fought for the light, truly align himself with such a force? His grip tightened on his sword, and he stepped toward Isolde, his heart heavy with indecision. "If I help you," he said slowly, "if I let you live, what guarantee do I have that you won't simply continue this path of destruction? What will stop you from becoming the very thing you were accused of being?" Isolde's skeletal face was unreadable, but her voice was filled with the weight of centuries of suffering. "I have no guarantees to offer you, Draven, only the truth. I was betrayed by those I trusted most, and in my pain, I became what they feared. But I am not beyond redemption. I can still fight for what is right. You've seen my memories, you know the truth now. Help me bring justice to those who deserve it, and I will lay down my crown when it is done." Rhaegar cursed, his voice raw with anger. "You can't seriously be considering this, Draven. She's a lich. Her very existence is an affront to life itself." Draven's eyes flicked between Rhaegar, Celia, and Isolde, his thoughts a storm of doubt, fear, and hope. He could feel the pressure of the decision weighing down on him, as though the very forces of life and death were balanced on the edge of his blade. To strike down Isolde would be to follow the path of the righteous hero, a path he had walked his entire life. But was it the right path? Or had the lines between heroism and villainy blurred beyond recognition? "Sometimes," Draven said quietly, "the choice between good and evil isn't clear. Sometimes justice and vengeance are the same." With a deep breath, Draven lowered his sword, his decision made. "I will not be the executioner of a truth that was never heard. I'll help you, Isolde. But if you betray this chance, if you turn on us, there will be no redemption." Isolde bowed her head, her hollow eyes gleaming with an emotion that Draven couldn't quite place. Gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper. You have my word, Draven. I will bring justice to those who betrayed me, and to the darkness that seeks to consume us all. Rhaegar's face twisted in disbelief. You're a fool, Draven. You're condemning us all. Maybe, Draven said, his voice steady, but maybe I'm giving us a chance to fight the real enemy. Without another word, Isolde raised her skeletal hand, and the undead army around them began to retreat, their bones clattering as they sank back into the earth. The crypt's oppressive weight seemed to lift, if only slightly, as the immediate threat subsided. But Draven knew that the true battle still lay ahead. Together, they would confront the force that had twisted Isolde's fate, the shadow that had consumed the kingdom from within. But the price of that confrontation was unclear, and the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. As they left the crypt, the question that lingered in Draven's mind, and that would haunt him for the rest of his days, was simple. Had he chosen redemption, or had he simply unleashed a greater evil upon the world? In the end, the boundaries between hero and villain, between justice and vengeance, had dissolved entirely. And the only thing that remained was the hope that, somehow, they could bring balance to a world steeped in darkness. For in this world, the choice of the damned was never clear, and the consequences of that choice would echo far beyond the grave.